Hello, everybody. I'm Chris DeLeon. I'll be talking to you about books that game developers read, books that helped me become a game developer, books that many of my coworkers, collaborators over the years have read, including by which category of career or team role they focus in. I want to start with a line here from Gabe Newell, founder of Valve, creators of the Steam game network, as well as the Half-Life franchise. The programmers of tomorrow are the wizards of the future. You're going to look like you have magic powers compared to everybody else. And though he's speaking to programmers, which I'm partial to since I'm also a programmer, it's equally true about the designers, the producers, the artists, the other skills that we use in games. They give us the power to shape the world of tomorrow online, the digital spaces that our friends and families are going to be living in, working in, collaborating in. It's just a neat set of skills and neat thing to be able to do. A bit about my background. I started making games back in 1997, so it's been a while. I grew up in northern Missouri in a small town, and so I didn't have access to instructors or professors or mentors, or we didn't have any local game studios to learn from. It very much was me kind of learning on my own. My parents didn't know much about this field to help me with it. But I've worked since as a programmer, designer, producer, and teacher, all in games. And here's a couple of photos of me closer to your age, a school photo and a family photo. The biggest company I worked at was Electronic Arts for a while, off and on for a few years. That was back during the Wii and Xbox 360 era for Boom Blocks, Medal of Honor Airborne. So granted, these games are, I think, older than most of the people listening in the room, so we'll kind of leave those behind. But as a technical game designer for those doing levels and authoring upgrades and stuff. Smaller company I went to after that was working out of a friend's house. So games aren't always big studios. Sometimes it's 4 people in a room of someone's house. That company then got bought up by bigger companies, but by that time I was gone. But I worked at giant companies and tiny companies, as well as independently. These days I teach largely online, so I've got YouTube content and podcast and audiobooks, ebooks, video courses, and things that reach a large audience, especially with a lot of free content. And it's partly because I'm just so passionate about helping more people learn to make their own games, to get out there, start practicing, learning these skills. And it's part of why I'm grateful to be with you here today, as part of helping more people learn to make their own games. The lens I want to take to books today is that books are ability unlocks and access keys. So if you've been playing games and you find the right book and suddenly you can access a whole other part of the map, or you can climb, but before you couldn't. You can now throw a fireball before you couldn't. As kind of strange or contrived as that can feel sometimes in a game, that very literally is there are skills I didn't have until I found the right book, spent some time with it. It wasn't quite as easy as picking it up. And then I could program or make computer art or design better or work better with other people. And so it's kind of the books we're looking at today. It's really things where before and after you read it, your skills can shift from the things you've learned from it. And the things you can do have increased from the fact you found this book. And I truly got my start by reading and learning on my own. I can't stress enough how much no adults in my life were able to help guide me. I didn't have any mentors to turn to. Books were my way of finding access to experts that I hadn't met. I didn't know anyone to help teach me, but thankfully people who knew had written some books, and those books were how I got started. The books I began with are now both pretty dated, so I don't necessarily recommend starting with these today, but C for Dummies was how I started in programming, and Tricks of the Game Programming Gurus was applying some of those techniques to gameplay, graphics, input, sound files playing. C, by the way, isn't like a grade in school. It's still an industrial engineering standard for low-level memory management programming. I didn't know that. I saw this on the book. I thought, I make better grades in C's. Why not start there? Turns out it's a hard place to start, but, you don't know what you don't know. My first game looked like this. It was a letter X randomly moving around the screen. This wasn't even driven by the keyboard arrows. It just randomly decided, do I go left or right, up or down? Even that, I was pretty stoked, because this was a foundation of kind of everything I've done since. And once I made that X smaller into a single pixel and had it leaving a trail, and then had some other dots chasing that snake around the screen, and then had another item. When you picked up the item, then the snake would go faster or get some sort of power up or get points. I had a game. And it all built off of that. So the first games I made, they look even older than you might think. So yeah, it was 20 years ago, but also I was just a person working alone, figuring out as I went. Your first games will often be simpler and a little older looking. At the time, there were big fancy 3D games I was playing on Nintendo 64 and PlayStation on my home computer, but this is where my skill levels were at. And so I think it's helpful when we're figuring out when we're starting the kind of things we start. It might be like when you start playing piano, it might be Mary Had a Little Lamb before you're doing great classical works. It's often going to be a little simpler when you're starting out. I went to college for a computer science degree at Carnegie Mellon. There I got together a bunch of other people in a kind of a whole area I hadn't explored yet and appreciated was how much building games could be a hugely social activity. Sometimes people wrongly stereotype game making as if it's sort of off in a dark basement alone, and really it's deeply ingrained with working with different people with different backgrounds, different goals, different interests, different strengths. And that's part of why we could talk today about different books people, different roles and careers and companies have, is because it's often meant by huge teams as the games get bigger and better. In the early iPhone game market, I made some of the first high chart games that were new on iPhone back in 2008, 2010. A lot of different work there, including some independent work. Went back to graduate school for more education. Big fan of education. Got my master's degree in digital media, which is a humanities field. So instead of computer science is a technical field, humanities lens is a little more like what are the cultural impacts, what's the history of it, what are the design principles. And during that time, one of the projects we made, it wasn't even part of a classroom, got 7 million plays online, which was mind-boggling to me. About half of those were from Asia. And it's just really neat that we built this space as a team of 4 of us in our free time, just laying out puzzles and characters and spaces, and then millions of people were running around in those spaces we made, doing the things we'd set up for them to do, and what a cool experience that was. Same thing there, like an undergrad, I got together a whole bunch of other people who also want to make games. We built games together, lots of small teams, and then today what I do is pretty similar. It's just fully online, leveraging the power of the internet, and we have people in 19 time zones building games together. Gold dots are project leads, blue dots are project contributors, but there's really no reason to be geographically bound anymore by, I can't work with them because I only know who I know in my city. As we get older and get more access to things, it's very easy to work across all over the world, building things together. And so the kind of games we build, if you're wondering, is it action games, platforming games, puzzle games, adventure, horror? It's kind of all of the above. I've worked on over 150 games, a lot of them just free for fun or for learning. But so even though we're talking about game development here largely as career lens, I also want to validate that a lot of game making happens in the same way people like to dance or sing or write stories or draw, because it's a fun and awesome thing to do. Some game development skill areas, like I alluded to, it takes a team. This is not even all the different roles. This is just a subset of those roles. And there's kind of 3 in particular I want to focus on that can be confusing to some people because the words might mean something in some different field. And I want to translate, before we talk about what books they might read, what those words really mean in games. So producers, you might hear producer and think like a movie producer, Steven Spielberg type. But really what producers do in game teams is they help people work better together. They figure out that we need to get a meeting going between this animator and that artist or that programmer. They figure out that this person's falling behind schedule. Why is that? Do they need some help? What kind of support do they need? It's asking constantly, are we using our time well? Is this an effective use of the first half of the project? Are we where we should be at for 2 months before this game is finished? And producers, really, they work more with people than with computers. So you might even see something where it's like, you know, I want to be a part of making games. Game making sounds awesome, but really I love working with people all the time. Might want to be a producer. It's someone where really they're wandering the office, talking to everybody else, checking in on people. It's a very human-centered role. Game designers, sometimes this is a very also nebulous term. People picture, they might mean game design means all of it. They might think it means logos, but really game designer, it's not about graphic design in most cases. It's really decisions about levels, items, and enemies is the most concrete way to think about it. Where is the castle? Inside the castle, where are the hallways? In those hallways, where are the bad guys? How much health do the bad guys have? If I pick up an item, how many arrows are in that box? These are things game designers talk about, negotiate with each other, make decisions, try out, experiment, but they're often exploring what can players do and what's placed where. It's not always level design quite literally in that same sense. It's also puzzle game design. It also includes in a rhythm game. There's a different type of design to that experience, but it's questions like those. What programmers do is they explain the game so specifically that it works. They have to explain it both to the computer, which is what we see on the left here, and to other programmers on their team, which is like a diagram we see on the right. And they're really defining it into existence. Artists are producing art, musicians are producing music, different people on the team make different pieces of it. Designers have ideas for how to weave it together, but the programmers tying those pieces together, explain to the computer very, very, very finely, here's how it's all going to work so that we can run around with our controller, jump when we want to jump, climb when we want to climb. They're basically just working constantly with how can we get our ideas playable on computer. Now, the books that game developers read, grouped by career, I want to put a big clarification up first, which is that these books were not written for elementary school in mind. There's nothing inappropriate in them, but they just weren't written for, grade school. They were intended for kind of college or high school or older, and they're the same books that my professionals in the industry read. So because of that, I want to put some caveats for it. It takes a different way to navigate this kind of material, and I was still benefiting from this stuff before I was of those ages too, but kind of picking away at it. And it's a different strategy, though, than reading a storybook start to finish. So first of all, it's treating it like a buffet of ideas. It's recognizing that when you go to the buffet, perhaps, you get the salad, and then you get the really healthy stuff, and you skip the ice cream, that kind of thing. The same sort of thing happens when you're reading these books, where even if you don't get every single idea from it, if you get some ideas from it, that might be more ideas than you would have had otherwise. But to not stress out or put pressure on yourself or feel overwhelmed if chapter 2 kind of lost me, a lot of the time it's sort of a big old grab bag of ideas, concepts, terms, things that are going to help you connect other things as you read more books. to think of it as a puzzle to work out. So in the same way as when you're reading and you encounter a word, you're not sure how to pronounce it or what it means, you look it up in the dictionary. If you're reading one of these books and it mentions a concept, and you know what? You've never even heard of that, and you can pronounce it, and you might even have read the definition, but you still don't understand it, Google it, look it up on YouTube, and learn about the concept, then go back to the book. But just like when you're playing your games, you'll encounter an obstacle. This giant gate won't open. There's got to be a key somewhere. Go off looking for that key. But approaching these books as a bit more of a puzzle enables you to work through them, again, even if it's not quite what you were maybe assumed to be the level 4. You got to go level up to get through it. To not expect to get it all in one read. A lot of these books I got some value from, but not a whole big chunks of it. I just kind of, I'm not sure yet. But I'd come back to it a year later, come back to it 2 years later, come back to it 5 years later. It's one of the nice things about books. They're persistent. It stayed on my shelf. And as I got a little older, I looked at it again and got more out of it. And every time I go back to it, I get more information, new information. And I don't think it was time badly spent on what I could get when I could at a head start, but it gave me a foundation to build on, especially as I kind of weaved my way back and forth between, now I'm going to try this one again. Now I'm going to go back and peek at that one again. And then fourth, when you remember, these are about skill development. So it's not quite like in the game where I picked up the books and now I can throw a fireball. You have to try the ideas from it. You can't just read about it and then, I know Kung Fu. You have to go from, I've read about how to do it. Now I need to go try what I just read about. And then I go back to reading more about it. And that's what enables us to base what we're reading on the stuff that we've tried. It sinks in better. It sticks. The reading makes more sense to us. It takes that constant back and forth. How to do it? I read about it. I go and try it. That wasn't quite as simple as I thought it'd be. Let me read more about it. Okay, that refers to this thing I just tried to do and got stuck on. But so for visual storytelling, let's kind of get some recommendations here. Again, kind of grouped by roughly career category. Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. A famous game designer was asked if you could have only one book on a desert island, what would it be? He said Understanding Comics. Ever since then, this book has kind of taken over that scene of, it's about visual storytelling. It's formatted like a comic book, but it's actually about comic books. It's very meta, and it's about the uses of symbolism, about the relationship between text elements and graphical elements, and ways that game designers have often found very helpful as well, about conveying to the player what we're trying to get across to them. But it's a very accessible, great place to start, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. If there's only one book you remember today, that might be one to potentially check out. For business skills, here I want to refer broadly more to categories in these specific books. But for CEOs, for producers, people who are team leads, it's helpful to learn about game industry history. It's not just trivia. It's not just curiosity. It's not ancient. It's still relevant. And in many cases, what helps us run our teams or our companies better is learning about how other companies got started, why they worked out or didn't, what else was happening in the market, the space, public attention at the time. And so for that, I found Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent a great resource. It's now about 20 years old, but remember, it's a history book. That actually means it's closer to the events that it's documenting from the 70s and 80s, which in some ways might actually be an advantage over a newer lens trying to remember what the heck happened 50 years ago. There's also books that can help you work better with people. So for me, this was 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey in high school. For my dad, throughout his career in life, it's been How to Win Friends and Influence People, which can sound like a hokey title, but it's a very old book. Got to give some leeway for that. But basically, it's just ways to be a better listener, ways to cooperate better with others, ways to help you and other people all achieve your goals together. And it's fascinating to me that as much as we can read books about how to become a better programmer, a better artist, a better designer, a better sound engineer, you absolutely can find lots of books and to look about how to work better with other people and what a broad, lifelong skill this can be to help us succeed in whatever we wind up doing with our lives. Now, if you see the CEO card and you're like, well, gosh, I want to be the CEO. Who doesn't want to be the CEO? Well, then the thing I recommend looking into that, it's another term for your Googling or to read about in books, is to look into entrepreneurship, which of course is just a fancy big word for starting your own company. Because the thing to keep in mind, and this has been true throughout my game development career, it's much easier to become the lead of the thing you start, right? It's much harder to find a team that already exists, already has a leader, and say, hey, make me your leader. That takes a while. That's very hard to do. If you're the one who gets people together and say, okay, team, let's get on the same page. Who's with me on this? You've kind of already set yourself up as the core or the center of it in terms of being able to help direct, dictate who all's involved. It's another lens into it. And I've started 2 different companies throughout my life. I've started literally dozens and dozens of game teams. It is absolutely a viable way to go about navigating the experience. For how to communicate better, kind of 2 different versions of communication here with outward facing from the team. So that's marketing. That's communications to our players, to the journalists, to other companies. That's marketing. And then HR is human resources. That's internal. That's how we communicate inside this company, getting on the same page, navigating misunderstandings, making sure we're all on the same standard of expectation. So Purple Cow by Seth Godin, just like the title implies, it's about eye-catching things, purple cows. When you see a purple cow, you're noticing it because you've never seen a purple cow. And it's an entire book about how It has to be built into what we're designing. And the games that take off, the games that reach a huge viral audience, they are distinctive in some way. It's not just a slightly better version of what somebody else did. It's truly its own unique thing. And this has been a book that, for a marketing lens, also helps shape what kind of thing we do. Been very helpful to me. Verbal Judo by George Thompson, to me, is a fascinating book. I haven't found a lot of others exactly like it, where basically George Thompson is a former police officer who documented a series of techniques and trainings that he then helped other police learn about how to de-escalate stressful situations. When they're trying to arrest somebody and the person doesn't want to be arrested, how they navigate that in a way that makes sure no one gets hurt, everyone stays calm, and hopefully none of us are ever in those situations. However, the exact same techniques are broadly helpful for you're on a creative team of smart people who have differences of what they're trying to achieve. And if you're not careful, people can get their egos involved and get frustrated with each other. And it's just helpful to know some ways to kind of keep on the same page. So it's a bit like if you've seen a good karate movie and they emphasize that really the point of the karate is to avoid fights, it's to de-escalate fights, it's to contain and make sure no one gets hurt. It's that sense. It's not about winning or overcoming the other person with verbal judo. It's about how can we redirect that energy in a way that no one gets harmed and we come out of this with what everyone's trying to achieve. For inspiration and reference, lots of creative roles, among them writers, even sound engineers, have a lot to draw from in the fiction category of the bookshelves. Basically, all of it. And there's two different ways that that's helpful. One is in a common reference. If it's very well known, they might say that really, we want the ambience in this scene of Dracula's castle. And lots of people know what that means because it's classic literature. They've read about it, and the books describe it in such a succinct way, separate from any film depiction, that it's a way to get people literally on the same page. Also, there's kind of famous works. So let's say that the writer's just browsing the bookshelves, finds this sci-fi book that no one else in the team has looked at, but gosh, the way they describe what this tree is doing on this bizarre gaseous planet, that's what they're going for in their underground caverns, the vibe, the energy, the feel. They can share that reference with the rest of the team and say, go to page 250, check it out. That's what we're trying to achieve here. It helps get the sound people on the same page about how scary this is or isn't, about what the person's thinking about how the stuff was framed. But it's basically treating this area of the library as a Lego box of building blocks that you and your team can reuse or adapt and remix. Speaking of bookshelf shelves, big bookstores have a game developer section, literally series of books related to games. And let me kind of high level some of these. So Steve Swink's Game Feel, one of my favorites, hard to find these days, but has an entire chapter on why Mario's Jump is better and how Mario's Jump is better. It's been around long enough, lots of the books have learned from this and copied Mario's Jump more effectively, but it's about that moment-to-moment movement and gameplay. Game Design Workshop by Tracy Fullerton. It's a series of exercises about concept. It's a non-technical book, not about programming, but it's about procedure, process, prototyping. Includes a lot of stuff about board games, which can be a great place to start because you can just make board games with markers and cardboard and playing cards. Great resource. Game Design Workshop by Tracy Fullerton. Level Design by Rudolph Grimmers is a book on how height of walls and lighting and spaces and width of spaces and hallways and how the player knows where to go affects the psychology of the player in a way that once you read it, you'll not look at game spaces the same way and can help you improve building better ones yourself. Rules of Play by Katie Sutherland's Eric Zeman, a little more advanced, but it's sort of a cornerstone of games academia, where basically every games professor, every games grad student is expected to have read most of this. And so it becomes a really good jumping off point to lots of other areas of research in ways that scholars study and write about games. The Art of Game Design, a book of lenses by Jesse Schell, is one where it asks a variety of different ways, lots of different ways. What if we thought about the game we're designing as if it was a toy? What if we thought of it as a training simulation? What if we thought of it as if it was a sport? And through these different lenses, we have different observations of things we prioritize, about what we communicate to a team, about the issues we notice. And it's just a great way, very accessible, again, non-technical book as well, to jump into thinking about game design. For the programming side, Game Programming Patterns, this is a fairly advanced one. However, it's also completely free. You can literally read it in the web browser, official from the source, the author himself, gameprogrammingpatterns.com. And it's just about ways to structure our code that have been applicable for decades, truly generations of game programmers that help our code be easier for teammates to work in. Great foundation. One of the things that separates someone who's not ready to work on a team from someone who has worked on a team is understanding things like gameprogrammingpatterns.com. Now, I've been a programmer for most of my career, so I can dive a little deeper on this topic than some of the others, or I've dabbled in the others, but this has really been the focus of mine. So you're going to read a lot more than just books if you're doing programming, right? You're going to be reading how-to tutorials, online forums of programmers discussing how they solve things, technical documentation, which is a very different kind of reading, team messages, still got to coordinate with everybody else, example code, and code by other teammates. Now, reading code is very different than reading a story start to finish. It jumps, it skips, it changes numbers. So let's do a little example here of looking at reading some code together. And this awful color scheme is how I started programming, so that's what I'm sharing here today. When we see a slash at the start of the line, and this is, by the way, pretty real programming. This is a comment. It tells the computer, ignore this line. It's a note to ourselves. So we're documenting what we're about to do. We're going to say, give the player items they get close to. We're going to have a for loop, which again can look very bizarre if you're not used to seeing this stuff, but it's highly standardized for decades. It hasn't changed. It's counting through each of the items, whether we have 5 items, 10 items, 100 items in our game scene. Each one's going to get a chance to use the code ahead. And then it checks what's the distance between the player and that item. How far apart are they? Are they 10 screens apart? Are they half a screen apart? Then we're going to ask a question. If the distance is close enough that they're overlapping, if they're really near each other, if they're basically overlapping and touching, then we give that item to the player. They obtain the fire spell. They obtain the armor. They obtain the sword. And we remove it from the environment. We flag this for next cycle. This no longer needs to be shown in the world. We've taken it away so they can't pick it up again. And then some closing curly braces to fragment our if question and our for loop. But code like this is super common. And again, it can look very bizarre if you're new to it. But code like this is also how enemies get bumped into in some games. It's how a door detects you're walking close to it, so it's time to open it. But these same sort of patterns arise all the time in programming. And as you get used to programming, you recognize there's really just a few key terms that keep getting reused and reconfigured in various ways. It's not nearly as complicated as learning, say, another spoken language with a huge vocabulary. It's sort of a couple dozen terms used very, very, very consistently. For how to read code, I used to work with ages 4 to 10 for a school year and built some custom software. One of those is a completely free game at learntoreadcode.com. It's a puzzle game where you're trying to crack a safe by following the instructions of programming code. It starts very, very simple and gets more and more progressively sophisticated as it starts adding more and more elements of programming to it. But it's a way to kind of learn how to skip and jump and return to and apply a variable to the function in a way that can make it easier to read the great deal of code you can find free online to read as well. I wouldn't stress too much about putting pressure on yourself. Am I a programmer? Am I an artist? Am I going to be a producer? What am I going to be? You're young. You got lots of time. Try a bit of everything. Read about different roles. Explore different roles. Try being different roles on teams. And through that's the only way. It's like a sampler platter approach. That's the only way to figure out what you want to order more of. That's the only way to figure out that I enjoyed the challenges of this. Or I found it really satisfying when I was doing 3D modeling about seeing my work and my ideas take shape. Some tips so you can get started early. There's truly no need to wait. I started in grade 7, but there are now so much better ways to start now than there were 25 years ago. A standard home computer really is enough. I want to stress, it doesn't need to be a high-end gaming machine. It doesn't need a special graphics card that's hard to get. Any home computer, any standard home computer can really be used to make games. It could be a laptop or desktop, PC, Mac, or Linux. It's not about, I don't have the right kind of machine. Truly, even Chromebooks can be used to make games at home. And it can even be modeled several years out of date. It doesn't need to be cutting edge, doesn't need to be current. It can be something that is a bit older, still be used to make the kind of games you make when you're starting out. And it's something like if every home had a piano in it, and you're like, well, surely someone here can play piano. You got a piano. To me, many homes have a game building machine in them. And I feel like somebody in that home should be building a game with it. Perhaps that'll be you. There's also a lot of great free tools to learn with. So you don't have to go out there and it's not about, we can't afford the right 3D modeling tool. We can't afford the good sound tool. Truly, the people I work with, even as adults, are still using Audacity to make sounds, which is free. Blender to make models, which is free. Photopea to do game art in 2D, which is free. Bitsy is also a great place to start. And that's actually a great way to even get through the fundamentals, the basics of kind of programming like thinking without as much intensity. But Bitsy is by a friend of mine, Adam Ledoux. You can assemble full games online that way. Unity is a bit more advanced, but it's the sort of thing that, again, is free for at the learning level. And even very sophisticated games are made with that. I encourage playing some old games to get a vocabulary of how to make simple play fun. When we're starting out, certainly the games that we play on our home consoles and that we get off of Steam today often are the result of literally hundreds of professionals working together for 5 or 6 years. And that's not where we can start when we're alone or with a small team. We have to figure out how can you make a fun game with fewer graphics, less complicated sound, less complicated animation, fewer worlds, less environment space. And that's where stuff like Qbert, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Joust, these games are older than I am, but they were also really helpful for me starting out because it's a way to make a game fun when you can't lean on quite as many models as we expect to see in modern games. In the long run, though, practice is what will make the real difference. So it's much like with sports or instruments or, for that matter, art, where it's really the time you put in. It's not just I learned how to do it, so now I can do anything with it. It's each time we do it, we get a little bit better at doing what we're trying to do. But that's it for my main slides. I'm open to some questions. I want to share again that free game. If you want to do the puzzle thing, totally free. It's not trying to sell anybody anything. LearnToReadCode.com. It's just a little puzzle thing to try to learn how code reading works. And for more about my background, if you're curious, ChrisDeLeon.com is my professional portfolio site. But any questions from the classes? I see some hands. Excellent.